It's Platt, and today we head to Czechoslovakia. That's next to Platt's Beer of the Week. So the particular beer we have today is Rebel Dark. There's a regular Rebel lager that is the flagship beer, but this is their dark lager that we're going to try today. Rebel, like I said, is a brand that is produced by, hopefully I'll get this right, Mestinsky Pivovar Brewery. Forgive me for some of these words. Anyway, produced by that particular brewery. The brewery itself is located in Heklekolov. Hopefully, again, I said that right. Czechoslovakia, located in the heart of the country. That particular village or city has had a long history of brewing, dating all the way back to the 1400s or 14th century. They allude to it on the website of the brewery, but the brewery itself is not that old, so don't get fooled by that. The actual history of the commercial brewery that we know of today dates back to the year 1834. It was originally opened as an inn/brewery. Doing a little research here, apparently the parent company has a similar model to what we see in some of the British pubs. There's a pub, brewery, inn, restaurant, you know, kind of a combo platter. And apparently they do that. They have 2 or 3 of these brew pub, restaurant, inns combinations there in Czechoslovakia. So very similar to that business model. The brewery itself took a few years to catch on, but by the late 1800s, roughly around 1880, it was time to expand. Europe was growing, the rail lines were crisscrossing the continent, and they decided to expand. So in 1880, they started a expansion project that they realized shortly was going to need a second expansion project, and they basically had a rolling expansion all the way till 1905. Now, unfortunately for them, by the time they got fully expanded and ready to take on the world, a few years later, the world decided to go crazy, and from roughly 1915 to 1945, they were having to survive 2 world wars and the fallout for that, what have you. In my research, I didn't see anything about the brewery itself being directly damaged, but they obviously had supply chain issues, which we totally understand today. They also had labor shortage issues, which again, in a time of war, is totally understandable. But they somehow seemed to survive that, got through the Second World War, and rise there thinking, all right, time to get back to work. It was just a couple years later, in 1948, that the communists, which had taken over Czechoslovakia after the war, had then socialized or taken over the brewery, confiscate the property from the rightful owners. Now, luckily for us, even though the communists had taken over the brewery itself was still trying to grow, do new things, what have you. And it's actually in 1964 that they created the Rebel brand. Again, the Rebel brand is probably most known for the base pale lager they had, but actually the first beer they created under the name was this dark lager. Apparently they had like a competition in-house, like, hey, we need a good dark lager recipe. And at the same time, they're like, well, let's play around with the name. And you have to give them credit. In mid-1960s, communist East Europe, to name something Rebel probably took a little bit of guts. And from what I gather, they were inspired by a local journalist/political writer, and that's how the name came about. So kudos to them. It was roughly about 26 years later, in 1990, that the communist regime finally fell in Czechoslovakia. And a few years later, in 1995, the brewery, all the property, stock, all that went back to the families of the original owners or the pre-communist owners. So they got their brewery back. And from what I gathered in my research, it appears they haven't merged with anybody. They're not owned by Molson Coors or AB InBev, Carlsberg, Heineken, or whatever. So they're still kind of a local, regional, mom and pop kind of brewery, which is kind of a cool story. Real quick, let's talk about some of the other beers. First is Bitter 11, a 4.5% ABV pale lager with a bite. Now, when I first read this, I think, was it just a Pilsner? But from what I gather, that's not what this is. If you're familiar with the term bitter or bitters, that is basically a English pale ale, or stylistically, that's what that is. But this is the lager version. I think this is just kind of a lager take on that, but not necessarily. I don't think it has quite the effervescence of like a Pilsner, if you get that. Next is Rebelca. Rebelca is a 2% ABV light beer blended with grapefruit and lemon juice. Doing the research, apparently they don't have, hard seltzer's not gotten over there yet. This is probably their closest thing to it. They have a whole line of these shandy type beers, which again is more popular in Europe. So this is probably their session style, fruity beverage line. Next is Holiday Special, 6.2% ABV. Double mashed beer. Now, what's a double mashed beer? If you've ever heard of a party guile, it's similar to that in that you make a big enough mash bill that you do 2 runnings off that grain and you get 2 different beers. One a generally big body beer, one a little lighter beer. And so that's what they're meaning by the term double mashed. And finally is Rebel IPA, 6.3% ABV. Yes, IPAs have made it to the land of lagers. And apparently the folks at Mestinsky, Pivovar Brewing, wanted to get in the IPA thing. And if you think about it, it's such a contrast to what they're doing traditionally, you know, in your Pilsner and lighter lagers, that, yeah, an IPA probably does stick out there. That's a region that probably does need an IPA. Well, before we try this particular beer, though, let's check out the stats. So today I thought I'd talk a little bit about brewing in Czechoslovakia. If you think about the major beer countries in the world, Czechoslovakia usually doesn't show up real quick, but it probably should. Brewing has occurred in Czechoslovakia, especially dating back all the way to the monasteries, all the way to 993, so over 1,000 years. And it makes sense considering that Czechoslovakia per capita has the highest beer consumption in the world. That gives something for you folks in Wisconsin to shoot for. Stylistically, the Czechoslovakians are similar to their neighbors in Germany. Pilsner, lager style beers, pretty straightforward stylistically. They're not producing ales like the Brits do. They're not pushing boundaries like the Belgians. Just pretty much straightforward, simple, clean lager beers. They're probably most known for the Pilsner style that was created there. Oddly enough, it was their German brethren, the brewmasters of Germany, that went to the U.S. after the Civil War to kind of create their fame and fortune. And they took that Pilsner classic, lighter, refreshing lager to the U.S., and that became the backbone of such brands as like Anheuser-Busch, Miller, Coors. There were so many German brewmasters that took that style of beer over to the U.S. We had, a lot of workers, whether, climate was warmer, or wanting something lighter, refreshing, and that Pilsner style was the perfect answer for what Americans were looking for beer-wise. So we can thank the Czechs for that. Real quick, talk about some of their bigger breweries. Of course, Pilsner Urquell is probably one Czech brewery everybody knows. They're the ones that perfected the Pilsner style in 1842, and again, we thank them for that. Next is Gambrinus. Gambrinus is named after the former King of Flanders. Flanders is a region in Belgium, known for its great brewing history. Now, again, different than the Czech styles. They're, adding coriander and candied sugar, and they're really pushing the envelope, doing all different, crazy styles. There are several companies in the beer business that are named Gambrinus. I know there's a distribution company, I want to say, based in San Antonio. I know there's some brands that use the name Gambrinus. We're referring to the brewery that's based in Czechoslovakia, just to avoid any confusion. Next is Starpelman. Hopefully I'm saying that right. It is Czechoslovakia's second largest brewery. It is owned by Molson Coors. Doing my research, it does seem like Czechoslovakia, as far as your larger breweries, have avoided just totally being taken over by the big companies. But this particular one, like I said, is owned by Molson Coors. And finally, Budweiser Budvar, the home of the original Budweiser. For those of you that may or may not know, in certain parts of the European Union, if you order a Budweiser, you will get Budweiser Budvar. And if you're wanting U.S. Budweiser, you would ask for a Bud. But a Budweiser is, to them, the true Czech style beer. So something to be aware of whenever you head to Europe and want an ice cold Bud. Well, with that being said, enough about Czech beers. Let's try a Czech beer. Oh, that's nice and dark. That is almost stout dark. Got a nice finger plus of kind of a darker khaki. This is light malt nose, a little spice on the nose. That may be from the darker malt. Sometimes you get kind of a spicy espresso note on some of the darker malts. Let's give it a try. Ooh, that is nice. That has more dark malt complexity than some of the pale lagers. Session black lager is a good example of a classic black lager. This almost has a hint of stout to it. Not necessarily the body. This is still very drinkable body-wise, but to me, it's a little more of the darker malt, the really burnt malt, the espresso. Again, sometimes you get a spice out of that. Kind of has a crisp finish. Kind of hits the back of your mouth a little bit. Probably more complex than I was expecting. I did have kind of in my mind, because I knew the Rebel Pale Lager, that kind of supposedly falls into the kind of generic European lager. I had that in my mind, but this is a little more complicated than that. Yeah, that is interesting. It not as much malt sweetness. There's plenty of malt on there, but it's not a sweet malt. You do get a little bit of it, but this is an interesting beer. Just something different. Definitely something I think I would change gear. This would be a beer I probably would use to cleanse my palate. Like if I'd had like some big IPAs or this, that, and the other. I think the astringency of those dark malts, wherever it kind of cuts through, would kind of cut through and kind of clean the palate. And actually decent little beer. Yeah. Well, I hope you liked this video. If you did, please subscribe down below. Also, please like the video because it lets YouTube know we're putting out good content. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please, or beers that you'd like me to try, please leave them in the comment section, or you can always contact me on the Twitter page. Till next time, bottoms up.